The bank was full of farmers. It was a Friday afternoon in December. The Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura on the Piazza Fontana in central Milan stayed open later than most banks in the city. Agricultural workers from the surrounding countryside had come in to collect seasonal loans and subsidies. By 4:30, the main hall was crowded. People stood in line. Some leaned against the marble counters, waiting. At 4:37, a bomb detonated beneath a table in the center of the hall. 7 kilograms of explosives concealed in a suitcase. The blast killed 17 people and wounded 88. The roof collapsed. The walls buckled outward. Fragments of stone and marble were driven through the bodies of people who had been standing in line. The date was December 12, 1969. In the previous episode, we examined the structure NATO's secret stay-behind networks, built to resist a Soviet invasion that never came. What happened in Italy was not a failure of that structure. It was the moment it turned inward. That same afternoon, 3 more bombs detonated in Rome and Milan. One struck the underground passage of the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro on the Via Veneto. 2 more exploded near the Altare della Patria and the Museum of the Risorgimento in Piazza Venezia. 14 people were injured in Rome alone. Another device found at a bank near the Teatro alla Scala was recovered before it could explode. It was deactivated by police and then, on the same evening, deliberately destroyed by the bomb disposal unit. The evidence it contained was lost. Within hours, police across Italy began making arrests. Over 80 people were detained. Almost all of them were anarchists. Among those arrested was Giuseppe Pinelli, a 41-year-old railway worker and anarchist. Pinelli was brought to the central police station in Milan for questioning. He was held for 3 days without access to a lawyer. On the night of December 15th, during an interrogation session on the 4th floor, Pinelli fell from a window. He died shortly after midnight. The police initially described his death as a suicide, stating that Pinelli had leaped from the window after learning that his alibi had collapsed. That explanation was later challenged by medical examiners and witnesses. An inquest concluded that Pinelli had suffered what was described as an active illness, a sudden physical collapse near the window, and that his fall was neither suicide nor murder, but an accident. The ruling satisfied almost no one. Commissioner Luigi Calabresi, who was in charge of the Political Investigations Unit and had been present during the interrogation, became a symbol of institutional violence for the Italian left. In 1972, Calabresi was assassinated outside his home. 2 members of the far-left group Lotta Continua were later convicted of ordering the killing. Meanwhile, another anarchist, Pietro Valpreda, a dancer from Rome, had been arrested and charged with planting the bomb. The case against him rested largely on the testimony of a single taxi driver who claimed to have driven Valpreda near the bank. Valpreda spent years in prison. He was eventually acquitted. The testimony was found to be unreliable. The anarchist trail was a dead end. But for years, the Italian public had been told that the bombing was the work of the radical left. By the time the investigation shifted direction, the political landscape had already changed. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what Italy was in December 1969. The Autunno Caldo, the hot autumn, had just shaken the country's industrial core. Millions of workers had gone on strike, demanding higher wages, a 40-hour work week, and improved working conditions. Student protests had merged with labor militancy. The Italian Communist Party, the largest in Western Europe, was gaining electoral ground. Regional governments were about to be introduced for the first time. A workers' charter had been drafted. For the Italian right and for the Cold War security establishments that considered Italy a frontline state, the trajectory was alarming. The false attribution of Piazza Fontana to the anarchist left was not an error of judgment. It was consistent with a logic that would become clearer as the decade progressed. And then the investigation turned. The truth emerged slowly, through a series of investigations that would stretch across decades. In January 1971, a schoolteacher named Guido Lorenzon walked into a prosecutor's office in Treviso. He had a story to tell about an old friend, Giovanni Ventura, a small publisher and neo-fascist militant, who had confided to him a desire to carry out indiscriminate bombings with the aim of destabilizing the country. From Ventura's name, investigators reached Franco Freda, a lawyer based in Padua and an ideologue connected to the far-right organization Ordine Nuovo, New Order. The circumstantial evidence accumulated. The composition of the bombs used in Piazza Fontana matched explosives that Ventura had hidden in a friend's home days after the attack. The bags in which the bombs had been concealed were traced to a shop in Padua, where Freda lived. Both men were arrested in 1972 and charged with planning the bombings, but the Italian judicial system produced no definitive conviction for Piazza Fontana. Freda and Ventura were acquitted in 1987 after a succession of trials, appeals, and jurisdictional transfers. The Court of Cassation ruled that while the evidence linked them to the attack, it could not be determined with certainty who had planned it or who had carried it out. In 2005, a final ruling by the Court of Cassation confirmed that the bombing was the work of a subversive group based in Padua, linked to Ordine Nuovo, and led by Freda and Ventura. But by then, double jeopardy protections meant neither man could be retried. The judicial outcome was remarkable. The highest court in Italy had identified the perpetrators of the worst terrorist attack in the country's post-war history, and yet no one could be held accountable for it. Piazza Fontana was not an isolated act. It was a method, and it had a name: the strategy of tension. Bombings designed to be attributed to the left, investigations steered toward false suspects, a climate of fear manufactured to shift public opinion toward authoritarian solutions, to make the Italian electorate associate the left with chaos and the right with order. The strategy required operatives willing to kill civilians, intelligence assets capable of controlling the investigation, and political actors positioned to present themselves as the answer to the crisis they had helped create. All three components were present. The Italian Communist Party, the PCY, was the largest and most organized communist party in Western Europe. Unlike the revolutionary movements the strategy claimed to combat, the PCY had committed itself to the democratic process. It participated in elections. It governed municipalities. By 1976, it would receive 34.4% of the national vote within striking distance of the Christian Democrats. For the architects of the strategy of tension, the threat was not revolution, it was democracy itself. The prospect that Italian voters might, freely and within the constitutional framework, elect a government that included communists was treated as a strategic emergency. And the response to that emergency was not political competition. It was the manufacture of conditions under which democratic choice could be constrained. The role of the Italian intelligence services in the Piazza Fontana investigation was not passive. It was deliberate. The forensic sabotage of the Scala bank bomb, destroyed by the disposal unit on the same night it was recovered, was not an error of protocol. That device, had it been preserved, would have provided chemical signatures, detonator components, and construction methods that could have been compared directly against the bomb that detonated at the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura. Its destruction eliminated the single most important piece of comparative evidence. General Giannadelio Maletti, who headed SED, the Italian military intelligence service at the time, was later convicted of obstructing the investigation. According to court findings, Maletti destroyed a report implicating the Padua cell of Ordine Nuovo and arranged for potential witnesses to leave the country before they could testify. His subordinate, Captain Antonio Labruna, was also convicted for facilitating the departure of key witnesses. Maletti subsequently emigrated to South Africa, where he avoided imprisonment. In a later interview, Maletti stated that the CIA had provided information about far-right groups in Italy, but that this information had not been acted upon in ways that would have prevented attacks. He described a relationship in which American intelligence monitored Italian extremist networks without intervening, a posture that, depending on interpretation, reflected either neglect, complicity, or the calculated management of a volatile political environment. A parliamentary report published by the center-left Olive Tree Coalition in 2000 stated that United States intelligence agents had been informed in advance of several right-wing terrorist bombings, including the December 1969 Piazza Fontana attack and the 1974 Piazza della Loggia bombing in Brescia, but had done nothing to alert Italian authorities or prevent the attacks from occurring. The same report alleged that Pino Rauti, the founder of Ordine Nuovo, had received regular funding from a press officer at the United States Embassy in Rome. The second claim was disputed, but the pattern it suggested of a convergence between far-right operatives, Italian intelligence, and American strategic interests would recur at every stage of the investigation, not as evidence of a single directive, but as a persistent alignment of interests that no official inquiry has been able to fully explain. The violence was not limited to bombs. It reached into the machinery of government itself. On the night of December 7, 1970, less than a year after Piazza Fontana, a coup d'etat was launched in Rome. Its architect was Junio Valerio Borghese, a former naval commander who had fought alongside Mussolini's Italian Social Republic during the war and had become a prominent figure in neo-fascist politics. The plan was detailed. Hundreds of militants from Stefano delle Chiaie's Avanguardia Nazionale were to occupy the Interior Ministry and seize weapons from the National Armory. 187 members of the State Forestry Corps, mobilized from their training school at Città Ducale, were to take control of the RAI television and radio broadcasting centers, the nerve center of national communications. At the Ministry of Defense, 2 officers later identified as members of the P2 Masonic Lodge had positioned themselves to support the operation from within. Licio Gelli, who would later become the most consequential covert political figure in post-war Italy, had been assigned the task of capturing the president. The Italian president, Giuseppe Saragat, was to be kidnapped. The head of the national police, Angelo Vicari, was to be killed. Borghese had prepared a proclamation. Its language was deliberate. It announced that the political formula governing Italy for 25 years had been abandoned, that the armed forces and the forces of order stood behind the new regime, and that the most dangerous adversaries of the nation had been rendered inoffensive. The manifesto pledged alignment with NATO, expressed support for the authoritarian governments of Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and outlined economic commitments that included Italian military participation in the Vietnam War in exchange for American financial assistance. The operation was codenamed Tora Tora, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Militants entered the Interior Ministry. Weapons were taken from the armory. Forestry Corps units moved toward their positions. And then, at approximately 1:40 in the morning, Borghese ordered the operation aborted. The reason has never been conclusively established. Some accounts suggest that senior Christian Democrat officials had been alerted and were preparing a response. Others suggest that expected support from elements within NATO and the Italian military did not materialize. Ordinary Italians learned nothing of the attempted coup until March 1971, when the left-wing newspaper Paese Sera broke the story. Arrests followed. Borghese was not among those detained. He had already fled to Spain, where he died in 1974, officially of a pancreatic hemorrhage. Many suspected poisoning. At trial, all 46 defendants were acquitted in 1984. The appeals court ruled that the conspiracy had not occurred, that it had been nothing more than a private meeting between a handful of elderly men. In 1991, after it was discovered that Italy's secret services had destroyed evidence involving Licio Gelli and Admiral Giovanni Teresi before the first trial, a new proceeding was opened, but the judicial record remained inconclusive. General Vito Miceli, the head of SYD, had known about the coup in advance. The Army's chief of staff had been prepared to supply additional weapons, and within months of the failed coup, veterans of the Borghese operation created a new subversive organization called Rosa dei Venti, the Wind Rose, an alliance of senior military and intelligence officers who aimed once again to overthrow the democratic government. The violence did not stop. It accelerated. On May 28, 1974, a bomb exploded during an anti-fascist demonstration in Brescia, in the Piazza della Loggia. The device had been placed inside a rubbish bin at the edge of the square. 8 people were killed. 102 were wounded. What happened next defied standard forensic procedure. Less than 2 hours after the explosion, the chief of police ordered fire brigades to clean the square with hydrants and hoses. Whether this was incompetence or something more calculated has never been established, but the effect was the same. The crime scene was sterilized before investigators could process it. Less than 3 months later, on August 4th, a bomb detonated on the Italicus Express, a passenger train traveling from Rome to Munich. The explosion occurred as the train passed through a tunnel near San Benedetto Val di Sambro, a stretch of track that would be targeted again in the Bologna station bombing 6 years later. 12 people were killed. 48 were wounded. Had the bomb detonated a few minutes earlier, while the train was still inside the tunnel, the death toll would have been far higher. Responsibility was claimed by Ordine Nero, the Black Order, a neo-fascist organization that had formed after the dissolution of Ordine Nuovo. It was later reported that former Prime Minister Aldo Moro had been aboard the same train just days before the attack. Some investigators came to believe that Moro may have been the intended target. Both the Brescia and Italicus attacks followed the same operational pattern as Piazza Fontana. Far-right operatives carried out the violence. The investigations were misdirected, and the judicial proceedings dragged on for decades without producing definitive convictions until 2015. When Ordine Nuovo members Carlo Maria Maggi and Maurizio Tramonte were finally sentenced to life imprisonment for ordering the Brescia massacre. Tramonte was arrested 2 years later in Portugal at the sanctuary of Fatima, reportedly while praying for forgiveness. The arc from 1969 to 1974, from Piazza Fontana through the Borghese coup attempt, through Brescia and the Italicus Express, required no further interpretation. The operatives changed. The targets changed. But by now, a decade into the campaign, even members of the Italian government were beginning to act as though they knew what was happening inside their own institutions. By 1974, the pattern was no longer deniable. Italy's defense minister, Giulio Andreotti, the same man who would later reveal the existence of Gladio, replaced a dozen high-ranking military officials and placed the armed forces on alert to prevent yet another coup, this one organized by Edgardo Sogno. The head of SYD, Vito Miceli, was arrested in October of that year on charges of conspiracy against the state. He was acquitted in 1978. But the Italian intelligence services were subsequently reorganized under a 1977 law that split SAD into two new agencies, SISME and SISDE, in an attempt to impose civilian oversight. The reorganization changed the names. Whether it changed the behavior remained an open question. The most consequential act of political violence in post-war Italy did not come from the far right. It came from the far left. But the circumstances surrounding it have never been fully explained. Aldo Moro was the president of the Christian Democratic Party and a former prime minister. By 1978, he had become the principal architect of what was known as the Historic Compromise, an unprecedented political agreement that would bring the Italian Communist Party into a governing coalition with the Christian Democrats. The proposal alarmed both superpowers. The United States feared that communist participation in a NATO government would compromise alliance security. The Soviet Union opposed the arrangement because it represented a form of independence from Moscow. On the morning of March 16, 1978, the very day the new government was to face a confidence vote in Parliament, Moro's two-car convoy was ambushed on Via Fani in Rome by a unit of the Red Brigades. The attackers, using automatic weapons and wearing stolen Alitalia airline uniforms, killed all 5 of Moro's bodyguards in a matter of seconds. Moro himself was taken alive. He was held for 55 days. During that time, the Red Brigade subjected him to what they called a people's trial. Moro wrote letters to his family, to his party colleagues, to the Pope. The letters were delivered by the terrorists and published in the Italian press. In them, Moro pleaded for negotiation, criticized the rigidity of his own party, and made reference to what he described as NATO's anti-guerrilla activities, a detail that, in 1978, appeared cryptic. After the Gladio revelations of 1990, its significance became considerably clearer. Moro's wife, Eleonora Chiavarelli, later observed that the letters contained no mention of the killing of his bodyguards. Given Moro's character, she considered it improbable that he would not have acknowledged those deaths. The absence suggested either that portions of the correspondence had been withheld, or that Moro's understanding of the circumstances of his capture differed from the official account. Pope Paul VI made a public appeal for Moro's release, asking the terrorists to return him without conditions. The Italian government, led by Giulio Andreotti, refused to negotiate. The position was described as the linea della fermezza, the line of firmness. No prisoner exchanges, no concessions. The Red Brigades announced their verdict guilty. On May 9, 1978, Mario Moretti, the head of the operation, shot Moro in the back of a red Renault 4. His body was left on Via Caetani in central Rome, symbolically positioned between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats and those of the Communist Party. 9 members of the Red Brigades were subsequently arrested and convicted. The guilt of the immediate perpetrators was not in dispute. What remained unanswered was everything around it. The failures of the rescue effort were extensive. The police search, one of the largest in Italian history, produced no result in 55 days. A Red Brigade safe house on Via Gradoli, which contained over 1,000 pieces of evidence, including the airline uniforms worn during the ambush, was discovered only through a chance water leak, but the lead was not pursued to Moro's location. The disconnect between the scale of the search and its failure fueled suspicions that the operation had been less than fully committed. Those suspicions were deepened by the case of Ciro Cirillo, a relatively minor Christian Democrat politician kidnapped by the Red Brigades 3 years later. In that case, the state negotiated, a ransom was paid. Cirillo was released. The contrast with the handling of Moro, a figure of vastly greater political significance, was not lost on the Italian public. This is the point where the investigation should have closed. Instead, it opened wider. In 1990, it was disclosed that Colonel Camillo Guglielmi of Sismi's 7th Division, the unit that controlled Operation Gladio, had been present on a street adjacent to the ambush site at the time it occurred. He stated that he had been there to attend a lunch with a colleague. His colleague later said that Guglielmi had arrived uninvited and that the ambush took place at 9 in the morning, a considerable number of hours before any plausible lunch engagement. On the day of the kidnapping, the most prominent members of the P2 Masonic Lodge met at the Hotel Excelsior in Rome, a few hundred meters from the American Embassy. Licio Gelli, the lodge's master, was reported to have said upon leaving, "The most difficult part is done." The Red Brigades later stated that they had destroyed material from Moro's interrogation that contained references to Operation Gladio, and the ammunition used in the Via Fani ambush was later found to have been treated with a specialized preserving paint, the same type found in weapons caches linked to the Gladio network. None of these details, taken alone, constituted proof. Some were contested, some were unverifiable, but they accumulated in a single direction, and the direction was consistent. What is not disputed is the outcome. Aldo Moro, the one Italian statesman with both the authority and the willingness to bring the Communist Party into democratic governance, was dead. The historic compromise died with him, and the Italian political landscape returned to the configuration that had prevailed since the end of the war: Christian Democrats in power, communists in permanent opposition, and the security apparatus operating in the space between. And then came Bologna, and with it, the moment the investigation stopped being about suspects and became about the state itself. On the morning of August 2nd, 1980, a Saturday at the height of the summer travel season, a time bomb detonated inside the air-conditioned waiting room at Bologna Centrale railway station. The room was crowded with travelers. Air conditioning was uncommon in Italy in 1980, and the August heat had driven passengers into the cooled space. The bomb, an estimated 23 kilograms of TNT and other military-grade explosives concealed in a suitcase, collapsed the roof of the waiting room, destroyed most of the main building, and hit a train waiting at the first platform. 85 people were killed. Over 200 were wounded. They were station workers, commuters, families setting out on summer holidays, tourists from other countries who happened to be passing through. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in post-war Italian history, and it remains the 4th deadliest in Western European history. The day after the attack, Bologna's police chief, Italo Ferrante, stated publicly that he was at least 95% certain the bombing was the work of right-wing extremists. A year later, a memorial plaque was unveiled bearing the names of the victims and condemning fascist terrorism. The clock at the main entrance to the station was stopped at 10:25. It has never been reset. Investigators attributed the attack to the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, the Armed Revolutionary Nuclei, known as NAR, a neo-fascist terrorist organization founded in 1977. NAR had close links with the criminal organization Banda della Maliana, which provided false papers, weapons, and explosives, some of which had been stored in the basements of Italy's health ministry. NAR also maintained contact with agents of SISMI and with military figures who were members of the P2 Lodge. NAR founders Francesca Mambro and Valerio Fioravanti were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Luigi Chiavardini received a 30-year sentence. Gilberto Cavallini was convicted in 2020 of providing logistical support, a conviction definitively upheld in January 2025. All maintained their innocence regarding the station bombing, though Mambro and Fioravanti acknowledged involvement in 33 other murders during the years of lead. But the investigation into who ordered the attack led beyond NAR into the corridors of the Italian state itself. Almost immediately after the bombing, the Italian press agency ANSA received a telephone call from someone claiming responsibility on behalf of NAR. The call was later determined to have originated from the Florence office of SISMI, the Italian Military Intelligence Service. The office's director, Federico Minucci Benincasa, was subsequently charged with obstruction of justice. Then a Lebanese connection was manufactured. False documents linking the attack to Palestinian groups and international terrorists were fed to investigators by individuals connected to SISMI and to members of the clandestine Masonic lodge known as Propaganda do P2. General Giuseppe Santavito, the head of SISMI and a P2 member, promoted a parallel theory attributing the bombing to the KGB. General Pietro Musumeci, the deputy director of SISMI and also a P2 member, went further. He arranged for a police sergeant to place a suitcase full of explosives on a train in Bologna, explosives identical to those used in the station bombing, along with personal effects belonging to two foreign right-wing extremists. The intent was to create a false evidentiary trail. Musumeci also produced a fabricated dossier titled Terror on Trains, attributing the attack to international terrorists with no political connections. What distinguished the Bologna cover-up from its predecessors was scale. The manipulation had graduated from suppression to fabrication, a distinction that marked not a deviation from the pattern, but its maturation into institutional practice. The central figure in this architecture of obstruction was Licio Gelli. Gelli's biography read like a curriculum vitae of 20th century authoritarianism, a fascist volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, a liaison between Rome and Berlin during the Second World War, a participant in Mussolini's Italian Social Republic. After the war, he reinvented himself as a businessman and, by 1970, had taken control of P2, transforming it from a Masonic lodge into a private intelligence network that operated outside all oversight. On March 17, 1981, Italian magistrates investigating the collapse of the Banco Ambrosiano raided Gelli's villa in Arezzo. What they found redefined the Italian political landscape. The list was not short. It was not symbolic. It was administrative. 962 names, members of Propaganda do. Among them, 44 members of parliament, 3 cabinet ministers, the heads of all 3 Italian intelligence services, 49 bankers, 12 generals of the Carabinieri, 22 generals of the army, 4 Air Force generals, 8 admirals, and dozens of senior officials from the judiciary, the media, and the civil service. The future Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi was on the list. So was Admiral Giovanni Teresi, the chief of the defense staff. So was the commander of the Guardia di Finanza. So were the editors of major newspapers. The prosecuting magistrates told Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani that Gelli had constructed what they described as a very real state within a state. They characterized P2 as a secret sect that combined business and politics with the intention of destroying the constitutional order. Also found in Gelli's possession was a document titled The Plan for Democratic Rebirth. It outlined the consolidation of media ownership, the suppression of trade unions, the reduction of judicial independence, and the rewriting of the Constitution to concentrate executive power. It was not a manifesto drafted in the margins. It was a strategic blueprint, and observers have since noted that its prescriptions bore a measurable resemblance to political developments in Italy over the following 2 decades. The P2 discovery brought down Forlani's government. It triggered a parliamentary commission of inquiry chaired by Christian Democrat Tina Anselmi, and it led to a 1982 law banning secret associations in Italy. The connections emanating from P2 extended into international finance. Roberto Calvi, chairman of Italy's largest private bank, was a P2 member. He was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in June 1982, bricks in his pockets. His death was ruled suicide, then reclassified as murder. No one has been convicted. Michele Sindona, another P2 affiliated banker, was poisoned in his prison cell. The full scope of P2's financial operations remains a subject for future examination. The journalist Mino Pecorelli, who had published cryptic articles connecting Gladio to the Moro affair and who possessed insider information about P2, was murdered in Rome in March 1979. The ammunition used was a very rare type, the same as that found in a weapons cache belonging to the Banda della Magliana, stored in the basements of the Health Ministry. Giulio Andreotti was convicted in 2002 of ordering Pecorelli's murder. That conviction was overturned on appeal the following year. In relation to the Bologna bombing specifically, Gelli was convicted of orchestrating the obstruction of the investigation. Courts in the 2000s identified him as one of the masterminds behind the massacre, along with Umberto Ortolani, Federico Umberto D'Amato of the Interior Ministry, and Senator Mario Tedeschi. All died before they could be tried on the substantive charges. Their responsibilities were nonetheless recorded by the judges. In 2022, Paolo Bellini of Avanguardia Nazionale was sentenced to life imprisonment in what became known as the Trial of the Principals, the first proceeding to address not merely who carried out the bombing, but who commissioned and financed it. 42 years after 85 people died in a railway station waiting room, the Italian judiciary was still working to establish the full chain of accountability. This is the point where the narrative shifts, from events to the question behind them. The question that connected Piazza Fontana, the Borghese coup, Brescia, the Moro killing, and Bologna was not whether individual acts of violence had occurred. They had. The question was whether they formed a part of a coordinated strategy, and if so, whose strategy it was. Vincenzo Vinciguerra, the convicted Piteano bomber whose testimony opened the door to the Gladio revelations, addressed this question directly. In his testimony to Judge Felice Casson in the mid-1980s, Vinciguerra stated that the violence was not random. According to his account, the far-right operatives who carried out bombings understood themselves to be acting within a framework that was supported or at least tolerated by elements of the state and the intelligence services. The purpose, he said, was to force the Italian public to turn to the state for security, and in doing so, to accept restrictions on civil liberties and to reject the political left. Vinciguerra described a mechanism in which the operatives, the intelligence services, and the political class each played a distinct role but within a structure that none of them fully controlled and none of them were willing to expose. The violence was functional. It served identifiable interests. But there was no single command structure, no signed directive, no moment at which a decision was formally made. There was instead an understanding unwritten, deniable, and effective. Vinciguerra's was the testimony of a man who had stood inside the mechanism. Its evidentiary weight was contested, but it offered something no parliamentary report could: the perspective of someone who had carried out violence with the understanding that the state would look the other way. The Italian Parliamentary Commission on Massacres, led by Senator Giovanni Pellegrino in the 1990s, arrived at a compatible conclusion from the opposite direction, not from inside the mechanism, but from above it. The commission found that while direct links between specific Gladio operatives and specific terrorist acts could not be conclusively established in every case, the circumstantial overlap between the stay-behind networks and the perpetrators of political violence was extensive and recurring. Between 1969 and 1988, Italy recorded approximately 14,000 acts of political violence. 428 people were killed. More than 2,000 were injured. The years of lead, as the period came to be known, left a permanent mark on Italian institutions and on the relationship between the Italian state and its citizens. The bombings at Piazza Fontana, Brescia, the Italicus Express, and Bologna Centrale remain among the most thoroughly investigated acts of terrorism in European history. Collectively, they consumed decades of judicial effort, produced thousands of pages of testimony, and resulted in convictions that were overturned, retrials that were ordered, and acquittals that were later contradicted by new evidence. The legal proceedings are, in several cases, still ongoing, and yet the structural question has never been fully answered. At every stage, the institutions tasked with accountability were compromised by the very networks they were investigating. P2 members sat in the judiciary. Intelligence chiefs answered to lodge masters. Military officials invoked national security to withhold files that might have closed cases decades earlier. What Italy experienced was not a single conspiracy directed by a single hand. It was a convergence of operatives, intelligence assets, political interests, and institutional blind spots that no single actor controlled and no single investigation could fully map. The violence served a purpose. The impunity confirmed it. Senator Giovanni Pellegrino, who chaired the Parliamentary Commission on Massacres, captured the difficulty precisely. The commission, he observed, was not investigating failures of the system. It was investigating a system that had functioned exactly as certain actors within it had intended. The commission's formal title reflected this understanding. It was called the Parliamentary Commission on the Failed Identification of the Authors of Terrorist Massacres. The name was not an indictment of the terrorists. It was an indictment of the institutions that were supposed to identify them. What Italian magistrates came to call the strategy of tension has since been applied to comparable patterns in other countries during the same period, countries where the same NATO coordination structures described in Episode 1 were active. The Italian case was the most extensively documented. The Italian parliamentary investigations were the most comprehensive. The Italian judiciary pushed further than any other, and the Italian public was left with the clearest picture of what had occurred and the most acute awareness of how much remained unresolved. Licio Gelli died in December 2015 at the age of 96, under house arrest at his villa in Arezzo, the same villa where the P2 membership list had been found 34 years earlier. He never served a significant prison sentence for his role in the Bologna investigation. Former Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, who had revealed Gladio, who had been convicted and acquitted of ordering a journalist's murder, and who had been charged with mafia association, died in 2013 at the age of 94. Of the senior figures implicated in the strategy of tension, almost none faced consequences proportionate to the scale of what occurred. The families of the victims of Piazza Fontana, Brescia, the Italicus Express, and Bologna Centrale have continued, across generations, to attend court hearings, to press for new investigations, and to insist on accountability. The legal proceedings, in several cases, remain active. 50 years after the first bomb, the Italian state is still in the process of accounting for what happened within its own institutions. But Italy was not the only country where these patterns emerged. The next case takes us north, to Belgium, to a series of attacks that were never attributed to any known political group. To a pattern of violence so methodical and so resistant to investigation that the Belgian public gave it a name. They called them the Brabant Killers. And the investigation into what happened in Belgium is the subject of what comes next.